The road south out of the North Korean mountains was a single lane of frozen ruts, and the young soldier riding in the back of the deuce and a half had stopped feeling his feet somewhere above the Chongchon River. He had thrown away things on this road. Men around him had thrown away their entrenching tools, their spare ammunition, in some cases their rifles. The trucks moved bumper to bumper in the dark with their lights off, and every few minutes the column stopped for no reason anyone could see, and the men sat there in the cold, listening for the one sound that emptied the stomach faster than artillery. A bugle, somewhere up in the Black Hills, a Chinese bugle, and then another answering it, and the men would tumble off the trucks into the ditches because they had learned in the last week that the bugles meant the enemy was already behind them. This was the United States Eighth Army at the end of 1950, the same army that had broken out of the Pusan perimeter in September, the same army that had marched north in triumph and stood within sight of the Yalu River and the border of China and believed it would be home by Christmas. Now it was running. It was running farther and faster than any American army had ever run, and the men had a name for it. They called it the Big Bug Out. And the worst part, the part that the official histories would spend years trying to explain, was that nobody was entirely sure who was chasing them or how many, or whether anyone in Tokyo had the first idea how to make it stop. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and I know that some of you have fathers and grandfathers who were on that road in that winter, men who came home and never said much about it. I want to do this story justice, because the question at the center of it is one that I think every person who has ever worked inside a large institution has asked at least once. When a great organization breaks down, when it loses its nerve and starts to come apart, can one person actually fix it? Or is that just a story we tell ourselves afterward? The United States Army, in December of 1950, bet that the answer was yes. It bet the survival of an entire field army, and arguably the outcome of the war, on a single man. And the strange thing, the thing that still gets argued about by serious historians today, is whether that bet was the smartest decision of the war or simply the luckiest. To understand why the Army made that bet, you have to understand just how far the Eighth Army had fallen and how quickly. So let me take you back to the high point, to the moment right before everything came apart. In the late autumn of 1950, the war looked won. After the landing at Incheon on September 15th, the North Korean army had collapsed. United Nations forces had recaptured Seoul, crossed the 38th parallel, taken the North Korean capital of Pyongyang, and pushed north toward the Manchurian border. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding from his headquarters in the Daiichi building in Tokyo, had promised the troops they would be home for the holidays. On November 24th, 1950, he launched what he called the Home by Christmas Offensive, a final drive to the Yalu to finish the thing off. The next day, the mountains came alive. The Chinese had been there the whole time. Beginning on October 19, 1950, more than 300,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army had crossed the Yalu by night, marching in the dark, hiding by day under camouflage in the hills, maintaining a discipline of concealment so total that American aerial reconnaissance had almost entirely missed them. They had fought a short, sharp series of warning attacks in early November and then vanished, and the disappearance had lulled the high command into believing the intervention was a token gesture. The warning had been there to read, if anyone in Tokyo had wanted to read it. On the night of November 1 and into November 2, 1950, at a town called Unsan, the Chinese had fallen on the 8th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division, one of the proudest regiments in the United States Army, and they had torn it apart. The 3rd Battalion of the 8th Cavalry was nearly annihilated, surrounded and overrun, in the dark by an enemy that came in waves through the hills, blowing bugles and whistles, infiltrating between the American positions before anyone understood what was happening. The regiment lost something on the order of 600 men. That was not a token. That was a sample. It was the Chinese army showing, in miniature, exactly how it intended to fight, and exactly what it would do to a road-bound American force that did not hold the high ground. The lesson was written in blood at Unsan 3 weeks early, and it was filed and forgotten. It was not a token gesture. On November 25th, 1950, the Chinese 13th Army Group struck the 8th Army along the Chongchon River, and they aimed their first blow exactly where it would do the most damage, against the weak and overextended South Korean corps holding the Army's right flank. That flank dissolved, and once it was gone, the whole position was unhinged. This is the part the popular memory of Korea tends to skip over, so let me put a number on it. At a place called Kunuri, on the night of November 30, 1950, the United States 2nd Infantry Division was ordered to withdraw down a road that the Chinese had already cut behind it. The Chinese had set up a gauntlet, a corridor of machine gun and mortar positions on the high ground on both sides of the only escape route, and the division had to run it. The result was a slaughter. The 2nd Infantry Division lost roughly 4,037 men in that fight, close to a third of its entire strength. It lost 46 artillery pieces, nearly half its crew served weapons, and about 30% of its vehicles. The 503rd Field Artillery Battalion lost every gun it had. The Turkish brigade, fighting alongside, took some 936 casualties and lost around 90% of its equipment. The first count of 8th Army losses in that single battle ran past 11,000 men. The military historian S.L.A. Marshall would later write a whole book about that retreat. He called it The River and the Gauntlet, and the title alone tells you what it was. If you're getting something out of this so far, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people, and for a story like this one, that actually matters. Now, back to the road. Because the casualties, as terrible as they were, are not the real story of what happened to the 8th Army that winter. Armies take casualties and keep fighting. What happened here was something worse, something that does not show up cleanly in a casualty table. The Army lost its nerve. The official United States Army history, written later by Roy Appelman and by Billy Mossman in the Green Book volume titled Ebb and Flow, documents the phenomenon the soldiers themselves named bug-out fever. It was the tendency to withdraw without fighting, to abandon a position at the first sign of envelopment, to look over the shoulder for the road south before the battle had even properly begun. The 2nd Infantry Division, the same division gutted at Cunuri, even had a bitter little song about bugging out. T.R. Fehrenbach, in his classic study of the war, this kind of war, put his finger on the deeper sickness. He wrote that an army in the field, in contact with the enemy, can remain idle only at its peril. And this army had become something close to idle. It had become an army that thought first about leaving. By early December, General Walton Walker had given up Pyongyang and ordered a general withdrawal. And here we come to the number that every serious account of this period reaches for, and that historians still argue about. How far did the 8th Army retreat? The answer depends on which unit you measure and where you start the clock. Some accounts put it at around 120 miles. The official 8th Army history puts the full withdrawal at 275 miles, and states flatly that it qualifies as the longest retreat in United States military history. I have seen both figures cited by credible people, and in my view, the honest thing is to give you the range and tell you that whichever end of it you take, the verdict is the same. No American army had ever fallen back so far, so fast, with so little fight left in it. The line that had stood near the Manchurian border in November was, by the end of December, sliding back toward the 38th parallel and beyond. And then it got worse, because the man holding this disintegrating army together died. On December 23, 1950, Lieutenant General Walton Walker climbed into his command jeep and headed north up an icy road in the Uijeongbu area, above Seoul, on his way to visit frontline units. Walker was a fighter. He had commanded the 20th Corps under Patton in Europe, the formation Patton nicknamed the Ghost Corps for how fast it moved. And it was Walker who had held the Pusan perimeter in the desperate summer of 1950 with an order that there would be no Dunkirk and no Bataan, that his men would stand or die. He was a hard, profane, stubborn man, and whatever you think of how the retreat had been handled, he had not quit. But on that road, a South Korean weapons carrier swung out of its lane into his path, and the two vehicles collided. Walton Walker was killed instantly. He was posthumously promoted to full 4-star general on January 2, 1951, and buried at Arlington. And there was a grim echo in it that nobody in that headquarters could have missed. 5 years earlier, his old chief Patton had also survived the entire war, only to die in a vehicle accident. Now Walker had done the same. So consider the situation as it stood in the last week of December 1950. The 8th Army was beaten, demoralized, and in the longest retreat in its history. The Chinese were estimated to have committed hundreds of thousands of men and showed no sign of stopping. The army it was supposed to defend had lost confidence in itself and, frankly, in its leadership. And now, in the middle of all of it, the field commander was dead. This is the wilderness. This is the lowest point of the story, and I want to sit in it for a moment, because the men who had to make decisions in that week were not looking at the tidy hindsight we have. They were looking at the possibility of losing the whole peninsula. And at the highest level, that possibility was being discussed out loud. On December 29th, 1950, the Joint Chiefs of Staff sent General MacArthur a message that told him plainly that Korea was not the place to fight a major war. Contingency planning for a complete evacuation of the peninsula, a second and far larger Dunkirk, was underway. This was not idle talk. Staff officers were studying the ports, the shipping, the order in which divisions would pull out. The question being asked in the highest councils of the government was no longer whether the United Nations could win in Korea. It was whether it could get its army out before that army was destroyed. MacArthur himself, the supreme commander, the architect of Incheon, had turned strangely defeatist. From Tokyo, he warned Washington that if the Chinese chose to, they could drive the United Nations forces off the peninsula entirely. He spoke of what he called a mission vacuum. He pressed for widening the war, for bombing China, for bringing in nationalist Chinese troops from Formosa, even for the use of atomic weapons. What he did not do, and this is the contrast that will run through the rest of this story, was go to Korea and look at the army he commanded. David Halberstam, in his sweeping history of the war, The Coldest Winter, draws this picture sharply. The Supreme Commander was directing a ground war he saw only from an airplane window and a situation map in Tokyo, a war he had publicly predicted he would win by Christmas. And now that prediction lay in ruins along 200 miles of frozen road. Into that vacuum, the Army made its bet. And to understand the bet, you have to understand the man. His name was Matthew Bunker Ridgway. He was born in 1895 at Fort Monroe, Virginia, an Army brat, the son of an artillery officer, and he graduated from West Point in 1917, the same class that produced his future boss, the Army Chief of Staff, J. Lawton Collins. By the time of the Second World War, Ridgway had become the United States Army's premier airborne general. He raised and trained the 82nd Airborne Division and led it into combat in Sicily and Italy. On the night before D-Day, at the age of 49, he jumped into Normandy with his paratroopers and then fought on the ground in the hedgerows for 33 straight days. He went on to command the 18th Airborne Corps, which he led through the Battle of the Bulge, and during the airborne crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, he was wounded by fragments from a German grenade. This was not a staff officer. This was a man who had been shot at, repeatedly, at close range, by choice, well into middle age. And he had already proven, in Europe, that he would do the hardest thing a commander can do, which is relieve the men who fail under fire. In Sicily, in the chaos of the night airborne drops, things went badly wrong, and Ridgway watched and learned and afterward made changes without mercy. He set physical and professional standards that were brutal, and he held everyone to them, himself included. He once said that the most important attribute of a combat leader was character, and by character he meant a specific thing, the willingness to accept full responsibility and to be physically present at the point of greatest danger. He did not delegate courage. In Normandy, when his 82nd Airborne was scattered across the hedgerows and his command was, for a time, a few men around a farmhouse, he picked up a rifle himself. The historian David Halberstam, in The Coldest Winter, describes a man almost entirely without the vanity that defined so many of the great captains of that era. A man who measured himself not against the press clippings, but against the soldiers in the line. That was the instrument the Army reached for in December 1950. Not a planner, not a diplomat, a fighter who would go to the front and stay there. And there was a detail about how he dressed for battle that the troops fixated on, because it told them everything. Ridgway went forward with a live hand grenade taped to one shoulder strap of his harness and a first aid pouch on the other. The men, with the rough affection soldiers reserve for commanders they decide they will follow, called him Old Iron Tits. It sounds like a joke, and it was, but underneath the joke was a fact they all understood. The general was carrying the same thing into the same place as they were. Ridgway despised showmanship. He once said as much, drawing a deliberate line between himself and the great showmen of the Army, men like Patton and like MacArthur. His style was the opposite of theatrical. It was relentless, personal, and physical. He believed a commander's job was to be where the danger was, in the cold, in the mud, in the frontline command posts, looking men in the face. Now, why him specifically? In 1950, Ridgway was serving in the Pentagon as the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Administration. And in that role, essentially, every report coming out of Korea crossed his desk. He knew the situation intimately, and he had quietly been designated, in advance, as the emergency replacement should anything happen to Walker. So, when Walker died, the machinery moved fast. The way Ridgway tells it in his memoir, simply titled Soldier. The call came on the night of December 22nd, while he was at a neighbor's house at Fort Myer. It was Collins, the Chief of Staff, and his old classmate on the line. Collins told him that Johnny Walker had been killed in a Jeep accident, that Ridgway had been designated to take over, and that he should get his things together and get out there as fast as he could. Collins asked what officers Ridgway wanted to bring with him, and Ridgway's answer, in my view, tells you the whole character of the man in a single sentence. He said he would go this one alone. It was Christmas, he said, and even a bachelor would have made plans. He would not pull other men away from their families on a few hours' notice to fly into a catastrophe. He would walk into it by himself. He flew to Tokyo and met MacArthur on December 26, 1950, and in that meeting came the exchange that historians have quoted ever since, because it defined the command relationship for the rest of the war. Ridgway, sizing up how much freedom he would actually have, asked MacArthur a direct question. He asked whether, if he got to Korea and found the situation warranted it, he had MacArthur's permission to attack. Remember the context. Everyone was talking about evacuation, about how far back the next line should be. Ridgway was asking about going forward, and MacArthur, to his credit, gave the only answer that could have saved the situation. He said the Eighth Army was Ridgway's. Do what you think best. With those words, MacArthur handed Ridgway a latitude that Walker had never been given, the freedom and the responsibility to run the ground war as he saw fit. I think that grant of freedom is one of the genuinely underrated decisions of the war, and it is the one piece of real credit MacArthur earns in this story. Ridgway took command of the 8th Army on December 26, 1950, and he immediately did the thing MacArthur had just authorized him to consider, which was to think about attacking. And then he did the thing that separates a good commander from a great one. He looked at the actual condition of his army and admitted to himself that it was not ready to do what he wanted it to do. His diagnosis, which he recorded in his memoir, The Korean War, is one of the most honest assessments any American general has ever written about troops under his own command. He wrote that he discovered the forces were simply not mentally and spiritually ready for the kind of action he had been planning. The men he met along the road, the ones he stopped and talked to, all conveyed the same thing to him. This was, in his words, a bewildered army, not sure of itself or its leaders, not sure what it was doing there. He visited command post after command post and found the same atmosphere in every one of them, a sense of lost confidence and an absence of spirit. He was not contemptuous about it. He understood that the spirit had been beaten out of these men by hard fighting and bad surprises, but he saw clearly that the spirit was the actual problem, more than the numbers, more than the equipment. And he saw, with an infantryman's eye, the tactical symptoms of that lost spirit. This is where Ridgway's own words are too good to paraphrase entirely, so let me give you the heart of it. He said the army had become roadbound. It clung to the valleys and the roads where its trucks could go, and it surrendered the high ground that controls those roads to the enemy. It had stopped patrolling, it had lost contact with the enemy to its front, so it never knew where the Chinese were until they were on top of it. It barely knew the terrain it was fighting on. Ridgway's verdict was blistering and unforgettable. He said the army was reluctant, in his phrase, to get off its bloody wheels and put shoe leather to the earth, to get up into the hills and the scrub and meet the enemy where he lived. That single image, getting off the wheels and putting shoe leather on the ground, became the essence of the turnaround. So what did he actually do? Here's where we move from the fall to the rise, and here's where the answer to our title question starts to come into focus. Because the remarkable thing about Ridgway's reforms is how unglamorous most of them were. First, he attacked the leadership immediately and without sentiment. At his very first briefing with the 1st Corps staff, he asked the operations officer for the plan to attack, and the officer did not have one, because no one was thinking about attacking. Within days, the 1st Corps had a new operations officer. Ridgway relieved commanders he judged to be defeated in their own minds, and he did it fast, because he understood that a frightened headquarters produces a frightened army. He also instituted a rotation system, so that division commanders served fixed tours and fresh, aggressive leaders kept coming forward. He was looking for fight, and where he did not find it, he removed the man and found someone who had it. Second, he attacked the physical misery of the troops because he understood that morale is not just a matter of speeches. He saw men in summer weight clothing in sub-zero cold. He pushed hot food forward to the front lines. He got mail moving. He got proper winter clothing and gloves up to the men in the holes. As he put it himself, he knew it was vital in restoring the fighting spirit of the troops, to make clear to all of them that their leaders were concerned for their safety and would not throw their lives away for nothing. Notice the balance in that. He was about to launch some of the most aggressive operations of the war, operations explicitly designed to inflict mass casualties, and at the same time, he was obsessed with not wasting his own men's lives. Those two things are not in contradiction. They are the same idea. A soldier will go forward and take terrible risks for a commander he believes is not careless with him. He will not go forward for a commander he believes is. There is a small scene from those first weeks that I think captures the whole method. Ridgway, touring the front in his open jeep in temperatures well below freezing, would stop and talk to ordinary soldiers, riflemen in their holes, and ask them plain questions. Where is the enemy? When did you last see him? Where is your commander? And what he heard, over and over, was that the men did not know where the enemy was, had not patrolled to find out, and had not seen a senior officer forward in days. So he made himself the answer to his own question. He went forward, constantly, where the men could see him, in the cold they were in, close enough to the front that on more than one occasion his jeep drew fire. He understood something that cannot be ordered into existence by memorandum. An army watches its commander to learn how afraid it is allowed to be. If the commander is in a warm headquarters 60 miles back, talking about how far to retreat, the army will be afraid, and it will retreat. If the commander is up on the ridge in the wind asking where the enemy is so he can go kill him, the army will, slowly, begin to believe that killing the enemy is once again the plan. Ridgway changed the mood of the 8th Army in large part by the simple, exhausting, dangerous act of being seen at the front every single day. Third, and this is the tactical corps, he got the army off the roads and back onto the high ground, and he ordered aggressive patrolling. He wanted contact. He wanted his units actively hunting the enemy rather than waiting passively to be found. He went so far as to order positions erased from the situation maps unless they had been confirmed by recent, actual contact, because he refused to let his staff frighten itself with phantom enemy formations. And he changed the entire object of the war as his army was fighting it. He told his commanders, down to the company level, to stop thinking about holding ground at all costs. Real estate, he said, was not the point. The point was the destruction of the enemy. Ground was to be taken only when taking it helped kill more of the enemy or protect more of his own men. This was, in plain terms, a strategy of attrition. The press would later give it a brutal nickname. They called it the meat grinder. I want to be careful here, because that word gets put in Ridgway's mouth and it does not belong to him. The meat grinder was what reporters and historians called the offensive because of the casualties it inflicted. It was a description of the method, not a slogan the general coined. And fourth, he told the army why it was there. On January 21, 1951, Ridgway issued a memorandum to his commanders that has come to be known by its opening question, "Why are we here? What are we fighting for?" He had sensed that the men did not understand the purpose of the war, and that you cannot ask men to die for a purpose they cannot name. The memo is striking even now. He told them that the fight was not about this, or that Korean town or village, that real estate, in his phrase, was incidental. The real issue, he argued, was whether the values of Western civilization would stand against communism, whether the rule of men who shot their prisoners and enslaved their citizens would replace the rule of those who held the individual and his rights to be sacred. You can agree or disagree with the Cold War framing. But as an act of leadership, of giving a beaten army a reason to turn around and fight, I think it was exactly the right instrument, at exactly the right moment. Now here's the part that I find genuinely impressive, and that answers the practical version of our question. Ridgway did all of this, the firings, the supply reforms, the change in tactics, the memo, the rebuilding of morale, in a matter of weeks, while the enemy was still attacking. He did not get a pause. On December 31, 1950, the Chinese launched their third phase offensive, the New Year's offensive, and Seoul fell to the communists for the second time on January 4, 1951. Ridgway pulled the army back again, roughly 40 miles south of the Han River. But, and this is the crucial difference, he pulled it back as a fighting army, conducting controlled, coordinated withdrawals, not as a fleeing mob. The bug out was over. The army gave ground, but it gave it on its own terms, and it stayed intact. And then, almost as soon as the army was steady, he went over to the offensive. He did it in deliberate stages, each one a step up in scale, each one designed to rebuild confidence on a foundation of success. It began on January 15, 1951, with Operation Wolfhound, a reconnaissance in force built around the 27th Infantry Regiment, the unit nicknamed the Wolfhounds. The purpose was almost psychological. Push north, find the enemy, hit him, and prove to the army that it could move toward the Chinese instead of always away from them. The operation inflicted an estimated 1,380 enemy casualties, the large majority of them from airstrikes, at a cost of 3 Americans killed and 7 wounded. Those numbers are lopsided because the point was not a decisive battle. The point was to break the spell. 10 days later, on January 25, 1951, came the real thing, Operation Thunderbolt. This was a much larger reconnaissance in force that grew into a general advance. Ridgway's method here is worth studying because it is the antidote to everything that had gone wrong in November. He advanced phase line by phase line. He kept his units tied together, flank to flank, so there were no gaps for the Chinese to infiltrate. He led with massed artillery and with air power, grinding down enemy positions before his infantry closed with them. He went forward on the high ground, with patrols out front, knowing where the enemy was. On the day of that counterattack, the 8th Army numbered roughly 365,000 men, facing an enemy force that intelligence estimated at something approaching 1 million. Ridgway attacked anyway, because he had concluded something the high command in Tokyo had not. He had concluded that the Chinese, for all their numbers, could not sustain a long offensive. And that judgment brings me to the single most important point in this entire story, the point that separates the honest history from the comic book version. I think any responsible account has to make it, and the most knowledgeable people watching this already know it is coming. Ridgway's turnaround was real, but it did not happen in a vacuum, and it was not the work of one man alone, no matter what the title of this video says. The Chinese armies that had chased the 8th Army for 200 miles had a fatal weakness, and Ridgway saw it clearly when MacArthur's headquarters did not. They had outrun their own supply lines. The Chinese had almost no motor transport and no air cover. Their soldiers carried their food and ammunition forward on their backs and on bicycles and pack animals, marching it down from the Yalu by night. They could sustain a furious offensive for about a week, the length of time a man can carry, and then they had to stop and resupply, which gave the Americans time to recover. On top of that, the Chinese were taking horrific losses to the cold itself, to frostbite in those mountains. So when the Chinese offensives kept stalling out after a few days, that was not only Ridgway's doing, that was Chinese logistics reaching their limit. It is worth correcting a myth here, because this audience cares about getting it right, and the popular image of how the Chinese fought is mostly wrong. They are remembered for human wave attacks, masses of men charging blindly into machine guns. That is not really what happened, and it sells the Chinese soldier short in a way that flatters us and teaches us nothing. The Chinese army that beat the Eighth Army in November was, in fact, tactically sophisticated within the harsh limits of its equipment. It moved at night and hid by day to neutralize American air power. It specialized in infiltration, sending small units to slip between and behind American positions, to set up roadblocks on the escape routes, and then to attack the command posts and the artillery from the rear, which is exactly what shattered the 2nd Infantry Division at Kunuri. The bugles and whistles that so unnerved the American troops were not theatrics. They were a command and control system for an army that had almost no radios. What looked like a mindless wave was usually a series of probing attacks designed to find the weak seam in a line, followed by a concentrated thrust through that seam. Ridgway understood this, and his entire method was built to defeat it. Hold the high ground so you cannot be infiltrated from above. Tie your units flank to flank so there is no seam to find. Patrol aggressively so you see the enemy massing before he strikes. And bring down such a weight of artillery and air on the point of attack that no amount of courage on foot can carry it. He did not outmuscle the Chinese. He outthought them, and then he let American firepower do the rest. The honest synthesis, and the one I believe the evidence supports, goes like this. The Chinese advance was going to culminate on its own because of supply. But it took a commander of real insight to recognize that culmination was coming, to rebuild the will of a broken army in time to exploit it, and to build the firepower machine that turned a natural pause into a violent reversal. Plenty of generals have failed to exploit an enemy's exhaustion. Ridgway did not. Victor Davis Hanson, in his book The Savior Generals, devotes a whole chapter to Ridgway's roughly 100 days in Korea, precisely because the timing and the judgment were so good. The Chinese gave Ridgway an opening. He is the one who saw it and seized it and made it pay. By February, the offensive had a head of steam, and the line was moving north for the first time since November. Incheon and the Kimpo airfield were back in American hands by February 10. There was a battle just before the famous one that showed the army was already changing, and it deserves to be named because it set the table for everything that followed. At the end of January and into February 1, 1951, at a place the Americans called the Twin Tunnels, the same 23rd Regimental Combat Team, again with a French battalion fighting alongside it, was caught and surrounded by a much larger Chinese force in the Central Mountains. The old Eighth Army would have run. This force formed a perimeter, held through the night, called in air and artillery, and in the morning, with the help of a relief column, it did not just survive. It mauled 3 Chinese regiments and held the field. The men who fought at the Twin Tunnels were the men who would, 2 weeks later, fight the decisive battle of the Central Front. They went into the next fight, having already learned the lesson Ridgway had been hammering into them. You do not have to run. If you hold the high ground and trust your firepower, you can stand against numbers and win. And then came the battle that, more than any other, proved the Eighth Army had been reborn. It happened at a crossroads village in the Central Mountains called Chipyong-ni. Here's the situation. In mid-February 1951, the Chinese launched a counterstroke against the Central Front, and the 23rd Regimental Combat Team, commanded by Colonel Paul Freeman, of around 1.5 million, had collapsed to roughly 200,000. But it was back in friendly hands, and this time it would stay there. Let me put the before and after side by side, because the contrast is the whole point. In late December, the Eighth Army was retreating, by the longest measure, 275 miles, gripped by bug-out fever, having lost 11,000 men in a single battle at the Chongchon, an army its own new commander described as bewildered and spiritless. Less than 3 months later, that same army, with largely the same soldiers, had stopped the Chinese cold at Chipyong-ni at a casualty ratio of better than 10-to-1 in its favor, retaken Seoul, and pushed the front back across the 38th parallel where the war had started. Same men, same equipment more or less, same enemy. The variable that changed was command. I think when you lay it out that starkly, you understand why professional soldiers regard this as one of the purest demonstrations of the value of leadership in the entire history of the United States Army. And I want to be specific about what operationally was different because, again, this audience does not want vague praise. It wants the actual mechanics. The November Army fought tied to its roads, in the valleys, blind to the high ground and blind to the enemy, reacting to Chinese envelopments after they had already happened. The February Army fought on the ridgelines, with patrols out front and flanks tied together, choosing its ground, leading every advance with a curtain of artillery and air power so dense that the Chinese, who had no answer to American firepower, were forced to attack into the teeth of it, or not attack at all. The November Army measured success in ground held. The February Army measured success in enemy destroyed, and let the ground follow. That is not a difference of equipment. It is a difference of doctrine and of will, and both of those came down from one man and were enforced by him in person, in a freezing open jeep, up and down the front, day after day. Which brings us to the reckoning, and to the part of this story where the channel's usual theme reappears, the gap between what a man earns and what the system gives him. While Ridgway was rebuilding the Eighth Army at the front, MacArthur was unraveling at the top. The Supreme Commander could not accept the limited war that Washington had decided to fight. He wanted to widen it, to strike China directly, and he increasingly said so in public, undercutting his own government's policy. In March 1951, just as the administration was preparing a careful diplomatic overture to open negotiations, MacArthur issued his own pronouncement that effectively torpedoed it. Then a letter surfaced in which he declared there was no substitute for victory, a direct public challenge to the president's authority. For Harry Truman, that was the end. On April 11, 1951, the president relieved General Douglas MacArthur of all his commands. It was one of the most explosive civil-military confrontations in American history, and the man chosen to step into MacArthur's enormous shoes was the one who had just proven he could actually win on the ground. Matthew Ridgway was elevated to Supreme Commander of the United Nations Forces and the Far East Command. Command of the Eighth Army passed on April 14, 1951, to Lieutenant General James Van Fleet. Ridgway did not get long to settle in before the test came. On April 22, 1951, the Chinese launched their largest offensive of the entire war, the Spring Offensive, throwing something like 700,000 men at the United Nations line. It was the climax of everything, the all-out attempt to drive the Americans into the sea, and the army Ridgway had rebuilt held. It held at the Imjin River, where the British 29th Brigade, and especially the Gloucesters, made one of the most famous last stands in British military history against the Chinese 63rd Army. That stand is worth pausing on, because it is the proof that the rot of the previous winter was gone, and not only from the American units. The Gloucestershire Regiment, a single battalion of something like 650 men, was cut off and surrounded on a hill above the Imjin, and ordered to hold a crossing the Chinese needed. They held it for 3 days against an entire Chinese division, found itself surrounded at Chipyong-ni. Attached to Freeman's command was a French battalion, led by a remarkable officer named Ralph Monclar, whose real name was Raoul Magrin-Verneret, and who had been a 3-star general in the French army, but had voluntarily reduced himself in rank to lieutenant colonel so that he could lead troops in this war. So you have an American regiment and a battalion of Frenchmen led by a demoted general, dug into an all-around perimeter at a crossroads, and around them, the Chinese closed in. The numbers, as recorded in the standard accounts, were roughly 5,600 American and French defenders, surrounded by something on the order of 25,000 Chinese troops, elements of 3 full Chinese armies. The old Eighth Army, the November Army, would have bugged out, and in fact, the corps commander above Freeman wanted to pull the regiment back rather than see it destroyed. Ridgway said no. He ordered Chipyong-ni held. He had decided to turn the village into a killing ground, to let the Chinese throw themselves against a prepared American perimeter, supported by artillery and air, and to bleed them white doing it. For 3 days, from February 13 to February 15, 1951, the 23rd held. The French battalion at one point fixed bayonets and counterattacked behind the scream of a hand-cranked siren and broke a Chinese assault face to face. American artillery fired over open sights. Air resupply and airstrikes came in over the perimeter. And on the 3rd day, an armored relief column punched through to the defenders. The result was the first clear, unambiguous Chinese tactical defeat of the war. The defenders lost 51 men killed, 250 wounded, and 42 missing. The Chinese, by the standard estimates, lost roughly 2,000 killed and 3,000 wounded trying to take the crossroads. Paired with a simultaneous artillery slaughter of the Chinese assault near Wonju, sometimes called the Wonju Shoot, Chipyong-ni broke the back of the Chinese central offensive. The Wonju Shoot deserves its own line, because it is the clearest single demonstration of the new way the Eighth Army fought. As the Chinese massed in the open to assault the central front, American forward observers and artillery were waiting, and they brought down a concentration of fire so heavy and so well directed that the attacking formations were torn apart before they could close. The accounts speak of fields of enemy dead. This was the whole theory of Ridgway's war made visible in a single action. Find the enemy with patrols and observation. Pick your ground. And when he commits to the attack, kill him with massed firepower rather than trading lives for terrain. Where the November Army had been surprised in the dark and cut to pieces from behind, the February Army set the trap, saw the enemy coming, and did the killing. Together, Chipyong-ni and the Wonju Shoot are why historians have called this stretch of the Central Front the Gettysburg of the Korean War. It was the high watermark of the communist advance, the place where the tide turned and did not turn back. Colonel Freeman's regiment received the Presidential Unit Citation, and the message to the rest of the Eighth Army was unmistakable. You can stand, you can hold, you can win. The bug-out fever was cured at Chipyong-ni. After that, the advance became methodical and inexorable. Operation Killer ran from February 21 through early March. Ridgway kept that violent name over the objection of his own chief of staff back in Washington, who thought it sounded bad in the press, because Ridgway said the name described exactly what the operation was meant to do. Then came Operation Ripper, beginning March 7, 1951, which drove the Army back up to and across the 38th parallel. Seoul changed hands for the fourth and final time on March 14 and 15, 1951, recaptured by Ridgway's army. The city was a ruin by then. Its pre-war population they held until they were out of ammunition and the wounded could not be moved. And when the order finally came that it was every man for himself, only about 40 of them made it back to friendly lines. The rest were killed or taken prisoner. The hill they died on is called Gloucester Hill to this day. A few miles away, at Kapyong, Australian and Canadian battalions, the men of the Royal Australian Regiment and the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry did the same thing, standing on the high ground and breaking Chinese assaults that should, by the arithmetic of numbers, have rolled over them. This was the United Nations Army Ridgway had built. Not just Americans, but a coalition that had relearned together how to stand and fight on ground of its own choosing. And it held at Kapyong, and it broke the offensive at a fearful price to the attacker. In the last week of April, the Chinese are estimated to have suffered somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 casualties against roughly 4,000 for the United Nations, a ratio somewhere between 10 to 1 and 15 to 1. The army that could not stop running in December had, 4 months later, absorbed the heaviest blow the enemy could throw and shattered it. That is the measure of what Ridgway did. So did the system acknowledge it. In the narrow sense, yes, Ridgway got MacArthur's job. He would later become the Army Chief of Staff. By the cold metric of promotion, he was rewarded. But here's the thing that I think this audience, of all audiences, will recognize. Ask the average person to name the American general associated with Korea, and they will say MacArthur. MacArthur, who was relieved. MacArthur, who got the ticker tape parade and the address to Congress and the old soldiers, never die speech. The man who actually saved the war, who took a broken army and made it whole and beat the Chinese with it, is the one almost nobody outside of professional military circles can name. The military historian S.L.A. Marshall, who saw a great deal of combat leadership across 2 world wars, wrote that, in his experience, no other individual performance compared with Ridgway's feat of taking over the beaten and demoralized Eighth Army in late 1950 and transforming it into a confident, hard-driving, unified force in less than a month. That is about as high as the praise of soldiers goes, and it has never translated into public fame. Some of that is the nature of Korea itself, the forgotten war, fought between the triumph of 1945 and the trauma of Vietnam, ending in a stalemate near where it started, which is not the kind of ending that makes legends. Some of it is Ridgway's own character. He genuinely despised the showmanship that made MacArthur and Patton famous, and a man who refuses to perform does not get remembered like a man who lives for the camera. And some of it, I believe, is simpler and harder. The work Ridgway did was the work of restoration, not conquest. He did not win a glamorous victory. He stopped a defeat. He took something broken and made it function again. And our culture has never been very good at honoring that kind of achievement, the unglamorous, grinding work of fixing what someone else broke. And if that sounds familiar, if you have spent a career inside any large organization and watched the person who quietly cleaned up the disaster get passed over, while the person who created the spotlight got the promotion, then you already understand the deepest reason this story resonates. The pattern is older than any of us. It was true in the Eighth Army in 1951, and I suspect more than a few of you have seen your own version of it. There is a coda to his career that, in my view, only sharpens the point. Ridgway went on to become Army Chief of Staff in 1953, the highest uniformed job in the service, and he used that job to do the same thing he had always done, which was to tell the truth as he saw it, regardless of what it cost him. In 1954, when the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu was collapsing, and there was serious pressure inside the government for the United States to intervene with force in Indochina, Ridgway commissioned a hard-headed survey of what such a war would actually require. The answer his own soldiers brought back was sobering, a forecast of enormous troop commitments, enormous casualties, and a hostile geography that would swallow an army whole. He took that assessment to President Eisenhower and argued against intervention. Many historians credit that argument with helping to keep the United States out of a ground war in Indochina in 1954. It is one of the bitter ironies of the period that the war he warned against came anyway, a decade later, fought in much the way he had predicted. And his reward for that kind of candor, for his habit of telling the civilian leadership things it did not want to hear, was that he was not reappointed. He served a single 2-year term as Chief of Staff and was quietly eased out. The man was, to the very end, better at being right than at being rewarded for it. I think that is close to the truest thing you can say about Matthew Ridgway, and it is the thing this audience, of all audiences, will understand without my having to spell it out. So, let me come back, finally, to the question we started with. Why did the Army send one man to save a beaten army? The answer, I think, is that the Army had correctly diagnosed its own problem. The Eighth Army in December 1950 did not need more divisions, though it would get them. It did not lack firepower or supplies. What it lacked was will, confidence, and competent, aggressive leadership at the top. And those things, unlike divisions, cannot be shipped across the Pacific in cargo holds. They have to be installed by a human being, in person, by example, by the daily physical act of a commander going forward into the danger and refusing to flinch. The army bet that the right man could change the character of an entire field army by force of his own character. It was a bet on the proposition that leadership is real, that it is not a myth we invent after the fact, that one person in the right place can be the difference between a rout and a victory. I have spent a long time thinking about whether that bet was wisdom or luck, and where I have landed is this. It was both, and that is the honest answer. The army was lucky that the Chinese supply lines were about to give out, lucky in the timing. But it was wise enough to put a man in command who would recognize the opening, exploit it, and rebuild the instrument capable of exploiting it in the few weeks of grace that the enemy's exhaustion provided. A lesser general, handed the same army and the same enemy and the same lucky pause, would very likely have squandered it. Matthew Ridgway did not. And that is why, when the histories are written by people who actually study command rather than collect celebrities, his name sits very near the top. The 8th Army he rebuilt would fight on for 2 more years, to a stalemate roughly along the line where the war began, the 38th parallel. It is fashionable to call that outcome a tie, even a defeat. But I would ask you to remember the alternative that was being seriously planned in Washington in the last week of December 1950. The alternative was evacuation. The alternative was the complete loss of Korea. South Korea exists today as one of the most prosperous free nations on Earth, in part because one man got off an airplane in a frozen, beaten country at the end of December, refused to plan a retreat, and asked instead for permission to attack. That is not a tie. That is a save. And the man who made it, quietly, without a parade or famous farewell speech, has every right to be remembered, and every right to be ranked among the finest battlefield commanders this country has ever produced. If your father or your grandfather served in the 8th Army in that winter, in the retreat from the Chongchon, or in the long climb back north under Ridgway, I would genuinely like to hear about it. Those men carried a war that the country did its best to forget, and their stories matter. Drop them in the comments below. I read them, and so do a lot of the people watching. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.